Okay, here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 5, Video 5. This is our last video for this chapter, so let's close me out and close this chapter out. All right, here we go. With this part of the chapter, they reference different studies in terms of anxiety, and what they try to do is they try to understand or have us understand that anxiety can have two main sides to it. One, it can be facilitative or debilitative, and it really comes down to our interpretation, and it comes down to the interpretation of the participant. So now as a coach, and I talk often about coach, physical therapy, personal trainer, it's like it comes down to how you prepare your athletes. How do you get them to understand that anxiety could be a part of the equation, and how they can actually process, or first recognize, if you will, then process and come up with coping mechanisms to help them be successful in their particular activity. Now we know from earlier that having lack of control of the environment or the situation can increase anxiety. This we know. But it's the perception of control, right? And I mentioned it earlier, right? There's only one thing you can really control in the entire process, and that's yourself. And as a result, you have to be able to articulate to your athletes and get them to understand that you can't control the external environment. You can't control the environmental stuff. You can't control the weather, the referees, the opponent, etc. You can only control yourself, and to a greater degree, how you process all those environmental factors and be able to have a better understanding of how you can not only recognize that early on, but be able to process. So it's the understanding that the perception of control of a situation, whether actual or not, is in essence a coping mechanism to help people with state anxiety. And how people interpret that comes, really puts in place whether it's a challenge or a threat in front of them. You're asking them to perform a skill, you're asking them to do something very particular. For some people, it could be a challenge, and others, it could be a very big threat. It just depends upon who's in front of you and their makeup, who they are. So as a coach, you got to understand that you have different athletes who are going to process, first recognize stress differently, and then they're going to process stress and anxiety differently. And within a high stress environment, some people fold, some people flourish. You have people who are great practice players, but they do terrible when you ask them to step on the field. Other people, they couldn't catch a football in practice if you asked them to, if their lives depended upon it. But you put them on a field, they excel, because they have different ways that they process. Each person processes stress, and for some people, they rise to the occasion, they flourish. Other people, they struggle in the higher stress environment, and so they end up folding a little bit. So you have to be able to educate your athletes regarding different coping methods, and be able to educate your athletes to get them to recognize what stress is and what anxiety is, so they can then implement in different coping mechanisms to help them process, recognize and then process stress. Because you might have an athlete where it's constantly a negative feedback loop for them. Now, understanding why arousal affects performance can help you regulate arousal, which is kind of interesting, right? But both in you and in others. And I'll preface this by saying, as a coach, right, you have to be able to be in the moment, call your plays, have a 30,000-foot view to see what's going on out in front of you. You can't get so wrapped up and so overly stimulated and overly aroused that you take yourself out of the ability to actually be a coach. And it's the same for the athletes. You have to be able to articulate to your athletes and help them with their arousal level, so they will not be overly aroused and have a heightened state of anxiety. And it's different for different people. Like when I played a couple sports in college, I played football, and I can tell you there's always one idiot in the huddle who's screaming his head off. That person's never a leader, by the way. But there's always one screaming. And I can tell you that is not the cause, but that's the effect. That's how that person processed the stress of being in a game environment. It's how they processed, and what manifested was a physiological response to the psychological component of stress. Screaming in the huddle. Drove me nuts, but I understood that that's how that person processed their stress in a competitive environment. So the book lists two main areas, and I know you're going to see these again. You're going to see these again somewhere on a quiz or on a test to 100%. They note these two main areas that increased arousal influences athletic performance, one of which is on the physiological side, increased muscle tension, fatigue, coordination difficulties, and the other is more on the psychological side, changes of attention, or cognitive side, excuse me, a change of attention, concentration, and visual search patterns. But they are codependent, right? One does affect the other. And we talked a little bit about it, and they actually do a good job here in a second talking about this study. There's two of them they list, but I only put one up here. They list the study where they asked college students, some were low trait anxious, some were high trait anxious, to perform a skill, throw a ball at a target. The ones who were high trait anxious, they ended up using more muscular energy before, during, and after their attempt. So you can just imagine you're an athlete, you're on the field of play, and you have high trait anxiety. You're basically pre-exhausting yourself even before you get on the field, and then while you're participating, you're exhausting yourself even further. And what happens is this, because they're both interrelated, and you start to now become, you have this heightened response loop, and you end up becoming more and more fatigued, you then end up having a cognitive side that ends up becoming more and more anxious, and it causes this vicious cycle. So the study itself, showed that the low trait anxiety people actually were able to throw the balls, but not be as fatigued as their high trait anxious counterparts. So the key point is that, the arousal that you have and the state of anxiety, they'll narrow your attentional field and narrow your focus, and you'll end up with tunnel vision. And you have this situation, and that book is a pretty long, protracted example of Tamika. And, it narrows their attention, right? And it's almost like a quarterback focusing on one receiver the whole time as opposed to being able to see the field of play. And so as a result, sometimes you have to pull your athletes aside and tell them, hey, I think you're kind of really wrapping yourself into some tunnel vision. You're focusing on one person, you're not seeing the field anymore. And usually that's through a increase of arousal, and there's an increase of anxiety. So as a coach, you now have to kind of pull that person off the ledge, get them to first recognize what is going on, understand what is going on, help them implement their coping mechanisms, and then be able to get them back out on the field of play to be able to see the full field. So, we have this kind of complexity in this process, and make no mistake about it, like when you're in a competitive event and you're playing a sport, it's a very complex environment. There are many different factors going on, many different things that are biting for our attention. But this statement in the book implies that we have a finite amount of bandwidth to be able to process everything in front of us. Now, as we excel, and there's a little bit of self-selection here, where people that are better able to process and they have more bandwidth, they're able to be competitive at higher and higher levels. But you got to understand that you only have the ability to process so much, and we can do things to help increase that capability. But when you have somebody who is highly anxious and they are stressed, that's going to consume or at least obligate part of that bandwidth away from processing what's out in the field of play in front of you. And it kind of gives us that tunnel focus, like I was mentioning before. So what the book notes, that the performance can probably almost often remain high at first, but you see this kind of negative effect as stress starts to take over. This heightened response causes a physiological response. There's more energy being used. The more energy being used causes the person to become less efficient. There's less bandwidth available. The less bandwidth causes a heightened stressor and anxiety response, which then increases the amount of energy being used at a physiological level. And you can just imagine this cycle getting worse and worse and worse. But as a coach, you got to be able to process that and be able to see that process happening and be able to pull your athlete out and kind of have some self-talk, have some positive talk with them to get them out of that negative feedback loop, to be able to get them to reverse that cycle. As a coach, Yeah, even as a supervisor, I talk about a little bit in terms of you might be managing people in an accounting department, but you can start to develop your own process to really put these 4 practices to the right in place to become more effective as a leader and help those around you. Identifying optimal combination of arousal related emotions needed for best performance. It's not perfect. And it's not exact, but there's a little bit different for each person. You got to recognize how personal and situational factors interact and influence arousal, anxiety, and performance, i.e. stress. Recognize the signs of increased arousal and anxiety in sport and exercise participants, right? And tailor coaching and instructional practices to individuals, very much like that pyramid that we had up before, where you have the scientific side and then you have the individual at the top of the pyramid. You're training for athleticism first, and then the person's at the very top of that pyramid. So you have to be able to kind of tailor some of your practices as a coach to those individuals. But I will say this, there's a definite combination, and sometimes you have to teach to the mean and coach to the mean. And some people might get left behind because you can't focus and have an individualized coaching style for every single person on a 100-person football team. It's just unrealistic. So you as a coach have to be true to yourself and true to what you believe, but you may have to adapt your style, to be able to have a little bit more reach with some of your student athletes. So I can't stress this enough. There's an optimal combination here. It's not exactly perfect, and it's not exactly the same for each person. And it ebbs and flows based on what the person brings into the practice environment, into the game environment. And frankly, it ebbs and flows based on who is in front of you. And the book notes this, and this is absolutely spot on. One of the best ways to understand what people are feeling at that moment is you ask them, Johnny, how you doing today? Oh, coach, I just got smoked on my physics exam. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to have to go in for some tutoring, etc. I don't know. Well, you know what, John? The good thing is you don't have to worry about physics while you're out here. We're playing football, we're shooting baskets, whatever it is. We'll talk about that with some of the other guys on the team, see if they have some resources, and actually we can probably talk with one of our tutors as well, and we can maybe forward that action. But for right now, let's just go ahead and compartmentalize that, and we'll go ahead and focus on our sport. Oh my God. As a coach, you got to be empathetic. You can't just say, well, suck it up, Johnny. It's too bad, deal with it. You have to be able to deliver the message that as a coach, you care and you understand and you see the perspective. And then in that just exchange right there with Johnny, we offered a solution or a way to forward the action. So he's no longer stuck in this anxiety mode where he's focused on how poorly he did on his exam. We're finding solutions for him. We've taken away the unknown. That's the art of coaching. All right, guys, good stuff. Done with chapter 5. Going to move on to chapter 6 now.